Hello and welcome to the Love of Wisdom podcast. I'm here with my good friend Will.
Hi, Robin.
And I thought I would get you on because you're a man with some interesting stories and interesting things to say.
A peculiar past.
Yeah, a colourful past. How are you?
I'm good. Tired. Yeah. Tired, but that's the very nature of what I do. So I live with tiredness.
Yeah. Is that are you referring to what you do as in the musician stuff, or as in what you do as in the sanctuary?
Both. We were still at 1 o'clock this morning. We were still feeding hedgehogs, and then 5 o'clock this morning we were still feeding hedgehogs. One of which a certain person not a million miles away from here actually brought to us a little while ago, and that's been quite problematic, that one. So it's taken a lot of hand feeding.
Yeah.
And then the gigs on top of that. It's all adds to the mix. But I'm good.
Is the hedgehog that I brought to you still surviving?
Yeah, we've had intestinal fluke and capillaria infestations. So we've had to battle worms and very nasty parasites in the intestines. But having got up to 220 grams, dropped 100 grams down to 120, which for an animal that size is a lot.
Well, it's like dropping half your body weight in a short space of time.
We're back up to about 160 now and gaining weight daily.
Okay, so that's positive. So it looks like it's through the woods, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, the old saying about not counting your chickens before they hatch, until we get a hog to release weight and we actually get it out there and released in the wild, we never take it for granted. Because the captivity causes all sorts of stresses which amplify the issues of internal parasites. So you can have a hog which has been trouble-free for a couple of months, and then suddenly from nowhere it's got worms.
That seems counterintuitive to me, because I thought worms being a parasite would be something that
you pick up from the environment.
Yeah.
They can be dormant in the system for a very long time. They can be passed on by the parent. But the stress of captivity causes that to
cortisol, which is the stress hormone, is present in most animals, as far as I'm aware, tends to have a fairly negative impact on lots of different health outcomes, including the sort of immune system becoming...
It tends to be the older hogs that from sort of, I don't know, a few weeks old, rather than the 1 or 2 week old ones that we get that suffer from this. If it's all they know, it's not so bad. But anyway, hedgehogs are problematic and they're tiring. So but I'm good.
Yeah,
I'm good.
Well, that's good to hear. For anyone who hasn't guessed it yet, Will is the husband of Claire, who was on the other week. So we're talking about Charlie's Place, the same sanctuary that has probably been getting annoyed with me constantly tagging them on Facebook in every post. I've just scheduled those; they're all automatic, so I'm not actually there doing it when it happens.
We don't mind being tagged in. Awareness is a huge part of what we do. So the connections, the tags, brings more people to the page. Occasionally means more donations, but more importantly, it brings people an awareness of what we're doing and what we try to do, which is important. Yeah,
of course. Well, there's probably about 4 or 5 people who watch my podcast, so if they haven't already made it there, then they might make it there this time. I think actually I got Facebook likes. I probably got more Facebook likes from Charlie's Place than Charlie's Place got from me, I would guess.
Yeah, you can never judge how these things are going to go. I mean, we have people in foreign countries that follow us for no other reason. I think they just find it interesting. And they get to know what we do. They follow the little videos that we put on. And I think they feel that they know a lot of the animals. I think it's a comfort thing, familiarity.
Do they tend to be vegans?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Okay, because I've definitely noticed a thing of vegans sort of attaching themselves to things with they don't necessarily have to be local.
Oh, that happens. That happens. We get a lot of people that just because we're an animal sanctuary and they happen to be vegan or an activist, they follow us.
Yeah.
We don't mind.
Well, more likes generates more attention.
Yeah, and at the times where we need to get a message out, be it a message about needed funds, or if there's something important happening, occasionally we might lose an animal, and we want the world to know why an animal has been lost. Whether it's because it's health problems associated with the way it's been bred for the meat industry, or whether it's through neglect. We want to get that message out there, so sometimes it's important that we get that that extra footfall through to the page.
Yeah, and I've noticed, I don't watch them particularly regularly, but I know you tend to do fairly regular updates, don't you, where you're sort of doing your little videos if you walk around the sanctuary narrating.
And they get watched, and they get I get people coming and asking me to, because I always start with either good morning everybody or good evening everybody, and I have people saying, go on, say it. And it takes me a minute to realise what they're after, and they want me to say to them, good morning or good evening.
I thought you were going to say they offered you a job as a radio presenter or something like that.
No, I mean, I've had people say that I've got the voice for it, but
not the face.
Not the face. Yeah. I've got a good face for radio. But I enjoy doing the videos, and I think it's important. It keeps that link of familiarity with people.
Yeah, it's nice for people. Even like, it does no harm for someone, even if they're not a volunteer or something, to have an insight into it and to feel connected with it. That is one of the few positives of social media, is the it's supposed to encourage and enable greater levels of connection, and if people can feel connected with things that they're far removed from, then that's got to be a positive in my eyes.
Yeah, social media is a remarkable thing. It's made the world a very, very small place. I think back to my days of travelling the world. It seems such a huge place because the internet didn't really exist then, or it certainly wasn't available on a commercial basis. It wasn't in everybody's homes and in everybody's hands and pockets as they travelled around. So the world seemed huge then, but it seems such a tiny place now.
Well, it's one of the things that I have a love-hate relationship with social media, because I'm a sucker for dopamine. So when I get those little hits from checking it, I tend to find myself compulsively checking my phone, and I'll get absorbed into scrolling for ages. And I stopped for a very long time. I came off of it for the purpose of trying to focus my energy where it was actually useful to focus, because I never felt good about it. I would always sort of come off of it after, an hour of scrolling. I mean, at one point I installed an app to monitor, to deal with my phone use. I used my phone to monitor how much I was using it.
It's quite ironic.
And there were days, this was when I was working a job that I enjoyed less, but I was on Facebook for about 8 hours a day.
It's so easily done.
And I couldn't believe how much time that was. But if you spend 20 minutes scrolling here, then you do 10 minutes of work, then you go on scrolling for 20 minutes more.
And I also think it can bring out a side of you that you don't necessarily, with hindsight, quite often you don't want that side to be brought out. I think you can end up being very argumentative for the sake of it. Yeah,
it definitely it has a disinhibitive effect, because you don't necessarily see the person in front of you. You don't see the consequences of what you're doing. I also think, and I think COVID probably accelerated this, so I found a massive appreciation for what social media could be during COVID, because obviously, I live out here sort of in the middle of nowhere. There's no one about, and I was quite far removed, and we weren't allowed to travel and so on and so forth. And I was feeling quite isolated. I was like, well, what can I do about this? And I started to use Zoom and stuff in the way that many other people did, although I was a bit late to the party on that. And then I suddenly realised that not only does this mean that I can communicate with my friends who I can't see at the moment because of the circumstances, but actually it enabled me to reconnect with people from other countries, from when I'd lived in Ireland and things like that. But what was I going to say? It says I tangented there. He said about the disinhibitive effect. Oh yeah. So one of the things that I noticed from that, and I think this is only a hypothesis. I would have to look into it more, but I think that one of the consequences of social media is that when we used to not have the internet, I vaguely sort of remember not having easy access to the internet. You had to interact with the people around you, the sort of locality to you. So you got a real diversity of perspectives, opinions, values, and it formed a sort of social policing as well. Like, you couldn't go off the deep end on some conspiracy theories because people around you would be like, what are you on about? And that sort of social policing has been removed to some degree by social media, although in some ways it's there to the extreme. But you can now go online and find a community of people who agree with you on everything and who are going down the rabbit hole with you, and that just reinforces everything. And so it's very easy for people to get very polarized, and
copy and paste has a lot to answer for.
Yeah. And whereas, like, I speak to people, for example, all the time. Like, I know so many people who will have tattoos, stickers, T-shirts, everything that say "fuck the Tories" or things like that. And I'm like, when's the last time you spoke to a conservative? And for most of them, they're like, "Oh, I've never really spoken to a conservative." And I'm like, that's a very strong opinion to have against a group of people you've never spoken to.
Scratching my ear and I'm knocking my headphones off.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, I think it can polarize opinions. It can make people think that they have opinions that they don't actually have. I think it can bring out the best in people, and it can bring out the worst in people. And talking about the lockdown and social media during lockdown, unquestionably social media was massive during lockdown, and I think it, in a lot of cases, it was an essential part of people's everyday life, far more than they think it is now. I think it was, and I think it did a lot of good.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess there are very few things in life that aren't a double-edged sword, and you have to take the good and with the bad. And life, there is no decision that doesn't involve a trade-off, effectively. And
true.
I don't think we'll ever know. We'll never be able to say social media was a whole good or a whole bad. But I don't know which way we'll decide the majority is when we look back on its.
Well, if you look at the way it's gone in the last 2 or 3 years, obviously with the last couple of years with lockdown, I don't think we could have perceived 3 years ago the way things are going to be now.
No.
5 years ago, oh God, no. 10 years ago, and I go back to perhaps when I was your age. No, not a chance. Not a chance. You can't comprehend how society is going to function in the future, because there are so many external factors, I think, that influence what happens. We don't know what technologies are going to come in. We don't know what is going to become an accepted part of our day-to-day life, and nobody could have predicted the way that COVID would change things, and what lockdown would mean, and the after effects of it, and how going forward from the lockdown period, not just locally but internationally as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Huge effect.
There's loads of things. I was wondering, because I don't know, how are you with heat? Because obviously we had that big heat wave recently.
Not as good as I used to be. Since I was ill last year, I really struggle with the heat. Really struggle with the heat. But ordinarily, I just like to get out of it. I don't like the heat.
See, I can manage it quite well, but obviously there was a lot of it was a big thing when it sort of topped 40 degrees for the first time, and some of it felt somewhat hysterical to me. In some way, it felt like the same way as we have whenever it snows in this country, where people go, "Oh my God, the weather is something we're not expecting. Everything has to shut down."
Well, somebody said to me, "You want to be glad that it's not snowing, because imagine shoveling snow in this heat." I kind of
What?
for a moment, I had to think about it. But I realised I would get my leg lifted.
Yeah. But I almost wondered, as that was happening, and people were so like, because there was a lot of things where people were being told not to come to work and things like that, and I was wondering to myself, would we react to this in such an extreme way if we hadn't set the precedent with COVID, that when there's a threat that we're not used to, that we take every extreme measure to minimize the damage? And I was like, I was wondering to what degree we have sort of psychologically prepared ourselves as a society to take those measures when faced with something unfamiliar and threatening.
I kind of think that sensationalizing things is a natural reaction for a lot of people. And I think social media, digital news, I think allows that sensationalism to happen.
Yeah.
And it can amplify the effects and the day-to-day coping mechanisms really for people. So I think, I mean, the heat wave in very many ways was blown out of all proportion, but for some people it was awful. I mean, for us at the sanctuary, it was hell.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Just awful.
I can imagine the animals struggled in it.
The animals struggle, but we have no mains water. All our water comes from a well, and the well had been dry for some time. So that means all the water that we use has to be taken to the sanctuary in my car in 25-litre containers. And we're using somewhere in the region of
How's your suspension?
It's pretty knackered. Yeah. 2 or 3 trips a day, during 30-degree heat. So the 40-degree heat was just awful.
Yeah.
And by the time you got to use some of the water, it was hot.
Yeah.
Quite literally, it was mid-30s, nearly 40 degrees temperature itself. So when you're using it to perhaps cool a pig down, it's no effect. The heat
Pigs
wave.
are quite good at managing to heat themselves, though, aren't they? They cover themselves in mud to...
Yeah, but in order to get mud, what do you need?
Water. Yeah, but, at least you don't have to... Warm water makes mud too.
Warm water makes mud, but what the pouring water in for the pigs into their water buckets, and the first thing they do is tip it out and roll in it. So then you've got to pour more in, and it's exactly the same again. And you could stand there for an hour, pour water into their buckets, they snout it out, roll in it.
Yeah.
So you've got to put more in. You can't leave them without water. And it was grim. It was grim. But we didn't have to do anything different to what we thought. We knew it was going to be a case of getting the water up there, taking measures to provide shade, get as many of the animals as we could into the wildlife hospital, where we've got an air conditioning unit, which battled it. We've got the wildlife unit, the hospital is not as big as this room we're in now. But it's a steel porta cabin.
Yeah, so it's...
And in direct sun, a steel porta cabin is not a pleasant place to be. So a large industrial air conditioner in a small, little tiny room, it managed to keep the ambient temperature to about 28 to 30 degrees, which is still pretty toasty.
Yeah.
But all the animals with internal parasite issues, that heat just amplifies the problems for them. We were getting hedgehogs coming in left, right, and centre in the heat because they were dehydrated. What tiny bits of rain had happened over the previous weeks, ordinarily the water would puddle. Well, it wasn't. It was just running away. It wasn't providing any moisture at all.
Yeah. Wow.
So, anyway,
I did notice when I was going out running and that because we had 2 days of really heavy rain recently, didn't we? And I was like, oh yeah, I'd forgotten what the ground looks like this.
And the smell.
Yeah.
The smell of rain on dry ground.
Yeah, I have this really strong memory of when I was a kid in Ireland. We were on this new build estate in Skibbereen, and we must have been about 12 or 13, and it had just rained, and you had the sort of fresh rain or rain or fresh tarmac sort of smell.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I really love that smell after rain. And
Yeah.
I remember my friends taking the piss out of me and being like, rain doesn't smell. There's no smell after rain. I was like, can't you smell it? Like, it smells like...
It's
and
3D.
they just
yeah.
didn't believe me that smell existed, even though we were surrounded by it.
It's funny. I mean, I have something called synesthesia, which... It's where your senses are all interlinked. Don't ask me to explain how it happens or why it happens or exactly what the mechanism is, but it basically means that sounds have texture and colour, and colours have smells, and to have the rain coming down and be able to smell what is happening is all part of that. It's a strange thing, and
I've heard of it before, but I'd only ever heard of it in terms of people could see sounds to some degree. But I didn't know that
it goes through everything for me. It goes through. If I sat down and did a bit of mental arithmetic, it's a visual thing. You know, up here it's shapes, and it goes in blocks. It's weird. Any school teacher, primary school teacher probably, would be able to talk to you about chunking when they're doing numeracy, they call it. And I suppose it's a little bit like advanced chunking or mental Tetris. You know, it's shapes.
Yeah.
Those shapes also occasionally have colour. So if you add 10 and 5 together, and I visualise 10 plus 5 equals 15, we know that.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a sort of reddy blue colour for me. Don't ask me why. I have no idea why. But you put 8 and 7 together, although I can't see red and green in the same way as a lot of other people because I'm colourblind for red and green, it's kind of a reddy green for 8 and 7. Okay. Whereas things like 14 and 1 doesn't really have a colour.
Yeah.
But 13 and 2, it's kind of yellowy.
That's
bizarre.
Yeah, and it seems somewhat humorously ironic to be able to see and attach colours to things while also being to other senses while also being colourblind.
What is peculiar is that a friend of mine used to do this trick at school because we used to have wax crayons at school. I'm that old, where they put a crayon in his hand behind his back, and he'd feel this crayon behind his back, and what he's actually doing is digging his thumbnail into it, and then he'd be, right, okay, you can take it off me now, and then he'd be, oh, what colour is it? And he'd be having a sneaky peek at his thumbnail. And I remember thinking to myself, like, oh, it feels a bit yellowy, this crayon. And it was yellow. There is no reason why that should be the case, but it was there, and that's my earliest memory of the synesthesia.
So, do you think it's associations built up over time in some way?
I've
then,
no idea.
Like, could you have learned to associate that texture with the visual experience of yellow, and it's sort of like extreme lateral thinking where you jump from one thing to another association.
It's very possible. I mean, there's a certain shade of purple that I remember being. There used to be a cartoon. This is before your time. A cartoon called Barber Popper.
Never heard of it.
No, you're unlikely to. Unless you're 50 plus, I think it's unlikely. And that colour purple was on there with a particular shade of brown. But the cartoon, there were sounds involved with that, and I can't for the life remember. I mean, if you put that purple up with that brown, the sounds would come to mind. So if I hear similar sounds, then the colours that I'm visualising are purple and brown. It's a very peculiar thing.
Yeah.
And I think the human brain works in ways that we don't understand. I mean, I had quite a nasty injury quite some years ago, and I ended up with, I think they called it hypothymesia. Which basically meant I couldn't forget. Very peculiar, and I had it for about 6 weeks.
So is this injury mine?
Yes. Yeah.
It is. I vaguely remember you mentioning the memory thing to me.
Very strange. I mean, before digital cameras, we used to have film.
Yeah. I do remember film
we
cameras.
had film.
They were around during my childhood.
And they either developed as prints or they developed as slides.
Mm.
And I remember every now and again growing up, my parents would say, right, we're having a slideshow tonight. And they would dig out all the slides, and they'd have a slide projector that would project the image up onto the wall.
Yeah.
And they'd have this box of slides, and I remember sitting and looking at them all like this. Well, that was kind of what was happening with my brain. I could mentally go through these images and sort of slot the slide, a bit like a thumbnail. A thumbnail image that may be associated with this on a digital platform. That thumbnail sort of opens up this podcast, this interview, this talk, this chat. Well, that's a little bit what it was like. I would have an image of an event, and it was almost like I was mentally slotting that image into my brain, and it would play back. And it's not just a case of I could kind of remember it. I could see it.
Yeah.
So as I'm talking to you now, I could probably 2 or 3 weeks after that, I haven't once looked at the watch on your wrist, but 2 or 3 weeks from now, I could have popped that slide into my head and I could visually look down and tell you what time it was on your watch at any one time. It's the most bizarre thing.
I mean, that... While I appreciate your point, you could just roughly guess what times we were speaking for.
Could do.
And there'd be no way for me to disprove you.
Could do, but it's gone.
It's probably a poor example. But
it went as quickly, as suddenly as it arrived. Somebody came into the room with a friend to get me to demonstrate something with this hyperthymesia. I couldn't do it. And I hadn't realised that.
How long after it got oncoming, did it disappear?
We think about 6 weeks.
Okay. Were you in the hospital for that entire 6 weeks?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's a.
But there was nothing that should have triggered that.
So was there? So obviously the incident that triggered it was you stepping on a landmine. What country were you in? Bosnia. Okay, so you stepped on a landmine in Bosnia. Was there any damage to the brain that would have...
I had severe concussion.
Yeah.
A bad concussion to the point of constantly being sick for about 3 days. But it was a concussive effect of a blast. You know, it was pressure to the ears that caused the concussion, rather than and the jolt of the head, rather than an actual impact. You know, a blunt impact to the head.
But it's still very reasonable to think that would cause some neurological damage.
But as suddenly as it arrived, it disappeared, and it was a very welcome thing to get rid of, actually. Very welcome thing to get rid of. But I've always had this kind of, I wouldn't call it a photographic memory. I think the correct term is an eidetic memory. But it's very useful playing cards. But it's also very useful, in my job as a musician. It's useful for reading books. I can look at a page, open a page up, and to a certain extent, I can read that page once I then go about my business for the next 30 seconds or however long it takes me to read that page.
Yeah.
I can still do that to an extent. But with music, it means I can log images. I can log a melody.
Yeah.
That melody has shape and it has colour and texture and sometimes even smell.
Well, I wonder to what degree, because one of the things... you get people who sort of specialize in memory, and they will they'll have little tricks for how they can remember long sequences of numbers and things like that. And what they tend to do is they tend to create stories and associations. And so every little bit of information is associated with something else. And I wonder to what degree your synesthesia?
Synesthesia.
Yeah, okay.
Synesthesia.
I wonder to what degree having all those associations facilitates better memory, because every piece of information has multiple associations to it rather than just trying to remember.
Yeah, I mean it's bizarre. I mean it's less noticeable these days with things like with having a mobile phone. You store the numbers in there. You don't have to remember them. However, previously we didn't have mobile phones when I grew up. They weren't a thing until the end of the 80s. You had to remember phone numbers, and it's bizarre. I mean, I didn't see Claire from, I think it was about 1990 through till 12 years ago. But I could remember her home phone number for over 30 years.
Well, I for me, sequences of numbers and letters, I'm very good at remembering them. I do pattern things. I was having this conversation with my friend recently. Like, to me, all phone numbers have a rhythm, and you just have to figure out which rhythm makes most sense.
Have a meter.
So it might be a 3, a 3, a 2, and a 4.
Yeah.
I don't know if that adds up to 11 or not.
Yeah.
But and actually it added up to 12. But yeah, so there's different groupings, and different numbers will make sense to me in different groupings. So it's always very rhythmic. But one of the things that during the first year of the Badger Cull, we would keep a cull zone wide list of registration plates for vehicles. And because no one really knew what they were doing and there was millions of people, we had 50 to 100 registration plates on this list.
Yeah.
And we would update this list regularly, print it out, give it to people. And one of the things that happened was that became very apparent very quickly is that I didn't really need these lists, because I could just remember all of these registrations.
You see the registration, you remember it.
And people would rather than looking at the list, because you have to filter through the whole list.
They'd ask you.
So people would call me up, and I'd be getting 10 phone calls a night going, is this registration plate related? And I'd be like, yeah, it's on the list, or no, it's not.
Yeah.
And I'd just have phone calls from people all the time, because I could just remember all these registration plates. And people used to jokingly call me Rain Man. And I was like, I don't know why it is. They just stick in my head.
Registrations tend to start with one letter and finish with 3 letters. And what I've always done is it's created either a phrase or a word around those 4 letters.
Yeah.
Hard to give you an example, but...
Well, if they make sense, if they form into a word or something like that, then it's much easier. Like,
it's whatever first
I remember there was
mind.
one. So this is from 8 years ago, 9 years ago. There was one that was P401 BAP, and I used to just call it BAP. And because I had a little saying for the 3 letters, I just had to remember 4, and it was like, so it just made the process easier.
So for me, that would have been PBAP.
PBAP.
Because it starts with a P and it ends with a P. PBAP.
Yeah.
Don't know why.
Who knows? It's such a strange thing, but yeah. Luckily I can't remember all those registration plates now. I've made way for more useful information. But
it's something that I won't understand. I mean, the logging of information in the brain is not something I've ever set out to study, which is weird considering some of the stuff that's happened to my brain over the years. It's not something I've ever given any great thought to, but it's an interesting one. And some people can't do it. Some people don't have that ability, but they can do other things. Yeah.
Well, I know someone who I've spoken to her about this a number of times. She's a psychologist, actually, so she has some understanding of what's going on, but she hasn't got the ability to visualize anything in her head. Like, when she tries to visualize anything from memory or imagination or anything like that, it's just blank. And like, she can list descriptors of it, but she can't imagine actually seeing it. Apparently it's quite a rare thing, but I think it does affect like a certain percentage of the population and things like that. So there are a reasonable number of people who have it, but at the same time, it just there's so many little variations of how people do these things. You could never get a comprehensive understanding of exactly how. Well, maybe we will one day, but we're a very, very, very long way away from this. Is a comprehensive understanding of exactly how the brain works, because there is so many different functions that the brain performs and so many variations on those functions, and quite often those variations don't happen in the way that we would expect them to, or based on the things we would expect them to.
It's so much of what we do is instinctive. We don't give thought to it. And the minute we try and give thought to it and try and analyse it, the instinctive nature of what we do then doesn't exist.
Well, yeah. Have you ever focused on your breathing or your blinking?
Yeah.
It's a nightmare. If you ever accidentally pay attention to your blinking, it becomes really hard to regulate your blinking.
And the breathing, trying to breathe to a rhythm. It's something that I have to do, with playing a trumpet. You have to breathe in a certain time, so it becomes very difficult to do it when you haven't got an instrument in your hand. I mean, if I listen to a piece of music where I'm playing, if I put up a YouTube video of me playing and I try and breathe at the point where I know I'm going to be breathing at the end of a musical fret, I can't do it. Because it's not instinctive, because I'm waiting for it to happen. Yeah,
and they're there because presumably because you're playing the instrument and you've gotten used to breathing at the same time as playing your instrument, you're not actually thinking about the breathing. You're thinking about playing the piece of music.
It's a musical phrase. It's a sentence. It's it has commas. You have what are called cadences.
Yeah.
There are 4 cadences: perfect, plagal, imperfect, and come on, people, help me. Perfect and plagal are the full stop cadences. Imperfect and interrupted are like commas.
Yeah.
And the cadence is basically the chord sequence. So a perfect cadence basically ends with the key chord.
Yeah.
Chord 1.
Yeah.
And preceding that is chord 5. Boom, boom. Finishes beautifully. Plagal cadence is like the Amen cadence that you'd hear in church. If I could play it for you, I would do. But you would recognise it straight away as something that you might hear in church.
Yeah.
It's chord 4 to chord 1. They finish. They're full stops. Interrupted and imperfect. It sounds unfinished. They would come halfway through a chord sequence. And naturally, your brain falls into the pattern of hearing certain things and knowing when it can, when it ought to be taking a breath for a reed player, or when you would take your hands off an instrument or whatever, or give that gap and leave the space to create the musical phrase. I mean, it's something that you start to do instinctively. Think about it too much.
Yeah.
It sounds unnatural and it sounds stilted.
Well, one of the things I've noticed, because I know I run a fair bit, and I know other people who run, and some of them will run with music, and I never run with music.
Can't do it.
And part of the reason I sync my breath to my footsteps, but when I'm syncing my breath to my footsteps, I'm focusing on my steps, and I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and it's in for 4, out for 4, unless I'm running at a slower pace, and it might be 3, or a faster pace, it might be 3 as well, because I need to breathe faster. Boring details I don't need to go into. But when I put music on, all I can feel is my breath. Like it seems to get rid of my awareness of the impact of my feet to some degree, and I just focus on my breathing, and I cannot get my breath and my footsteps synced up, and I just gas myself out really quickly. It's
a nightmare. I mean, I've done the London Marathon a few times, and whatever piece of music is in my head as I cross that start line is with me for 26 miles.
Oh yeah,
and I just have to hope that it's something that can actually create some sort of decent meter from a stride pattern. Because coupled with that is the breathing.
Do you carefully curate what you listen to in preparation? Then?
Yeah, the old Monty Python one is a good one.
Which one?
Yeah. But sometimes you end up playing it or singing it to yourself faster or slow, depending how knackered you are.
Yeah.
So you can vary obviously the speed of the piece of music, but what you've got to hope is that somehow it's all linked together, and you can breathe properly. But again, what you're doing there is you're creating something false. You're not doing it instinctively. If I do listen to anything when I have been running, I mean, I don't run now. I couldn't. I'm too wonky and broken. But I'm saying that in 3 weeks' time, I'm doing the Great North Run. But if I do, I'll listen to podcasts, interviews. A great one, even though it's got music in it, is Desert Island Discs.
Yeah.
Things like that, because you're then not concentrating on your breathing.
See, I don't listen to anything at all. Like I have my ears clear so that I can sink in with my body better. But I do, when I'm doing longer distances, particularly when I've done marathon, there will come a point where I can't focus too much on the experience of running anymore because it's shit.
It's too unpleasant.
I don't want to do it.
That gets me to about the 3 mile point.
Well, there's a lot more after 3 miles. But there will always come a point where I'm either talking to myself out loud or singing to myself out loud or singing to myself in my head. Like I will, music will play a big part, but it's self-generated. It's
amazing what does go through your mind, actually. I mean, little phrases start to go through mine. One of the most common is because I keep such a steady pace. I recognise a lot of people as I overtake them or they overtake me from earlier in the run. And what I've found is a phrase that goes through my brain so much is reel them in and pass them. I think that's what it was. Just reel them in. You can see them in the distance. You think, oh, yeah. And you reel them in. And it's just going round and round in my brain. Reel them in. Reel them in. And then you gradually get past it and past them. And you see somebody else and reel them in. And it's going round and round and round over the top of... And then you start to, you go a bit stir crazy. And I think it's why marathons like the Chesterfield Marathon was about the worst one I've ever done. Because a big part of it was on the bypass, the Chesterfield bypass from Hornsbridge roundabout out to the M1.
I'm guessing they hadn't closed it either.
Oh, and then they closed one side.
Yeah.
And then a big chunk was round an industrial estate. So it was so dull. Whereas something like London is fascinating. If you've never done the London Marathon, you must do it. Because it's
really hard to get in, isn't it?
It's very hard to get in.
I know a few people, I know some people who apply every year, and I know some people who are running it next year.
I'm convinced that I've got a marathon left in my body, whether it means I have to do it on my hands and knees, but I'd like it to be London. But I know that if I do another marathon, it's going to be a struggle, so I'd like it to be London. Yeah. Because it is just so fascinating. It's a city I know through visiting it for years and working there, and but it's a city I love. I love it for all the reasons that I dislike it as well, because it is so busy and there's so much there and there's so much to look at, and people down there are so strange. But that's what makes it great, and that's doing the London Marathon, it's 26 miles of pain, but you do it with a smile on your face because you're constantly surrounded by things to look at and do. And that takes your mind off the fact that your body is telling you that you are a complete knob for doing to it what you're doing to it. But yeah, the Chesterfield Marathon was just awful.
See,
awful.
I mean, I haven't entered any official races and things like that. Everything I've done completely off my own back because I'm strange like that. And, my first marathon, I woke up the day of my 30th birthday and went, you know what, I'm going to see if I can do it. And I just got my stuff together, put on my running vest, put some bars in the pockets, filled up my water sack, and was like, let's see how long this takes me. And it took me 5.5 hours, which is not a great time, but considering I did it. And that's sort of what matters with your first one.
Fastest I've ever done London was 4 hours and 2.
That's a pretty good time.
Which, considering what my body has been through over the years, I was happy with that. I think I've done it 4 or 5 times, and I'm normally around the anywhere between 5 and 6 hour mark. But yeah, just a smidge over 4 hours, and that was with an extended toilet break as well, because I was really not feeling very well. And the night before, I stayed at a relative's house and slept on a work surface in a utility room because there was no bed. It was the only space in the house.
Not great prep.
No. But having said that, in years gone by when I was in the army, I was doing the same distance an awful lot quicker.
Yeah.
An awful lot quicker. I've never been a natural runner. It's always been I'm not built for it. I'm very top heavy. So it's very hard. It's always been painful, even when I was fit.
Yeah.
I dislike it.
Well, I hated it for ages. I used to do it and force myself through it, but I never really enjoyed it. And then I got tendonitis in both my knees from being
unpleasant,
more ambitious than my body was prepared to deal with, and and it kept me out of running for 2 and a bit years. It was like it was a really long time, and even when I started running, I was running these tiny distances. It was like I had to build up doing like I'd run 50 meters down the road, because with tendonitis the pain feedback from your body is delayed, so you don't get an instant pain response when you've done too much. You get a pain response 2 days later. So I'd have to run 50 meters, wait 2 days, be like, okay, it's fine. Run 100 meters, okay, it's fine. And then I got excited, and then I was doing half marathons every week and things like that, because I was like, I can run. And since then I've really enjoyed running, and I don't know whether that's just me being stubborn and rebellious and basically being like, you can't tell me I can't do something. It's always my own body.
It's always possible to push your body further than you want to. I remember Claire doing I think it was the Worksop half marathon quite some years ago, and bless her, she's always been very self-deprecating when it comes to her ability with running, but she started out not being able to run for any more than 2 or 3 minutes at any one time. And then she did a London Marathon, with psoriatic arthritis just a few years ago. But I think it was the Worksop half marathon where she was running with a guy most of the way round who was obviously, I think they were chatting a lot, and her mind was off things, but he must have been going at a reasonable pace, and she must have been on good form, and she absolutely blitzed her personal best. And I think she ended up, was it plantar fasciitis?
I got that when I walked to coast, and it really hurts.
She was in a lot of agony.
Did you have to do the thing with the golf ball where you like roll your foot on a golf ball?
I've heard of that. Yeah, people have mentioned that, but
it's not a pleasant experience.
Oh, she was in trouble. But it's just because she'd pushed herself so hard over the course of the 13 miles, and then tear-assed over the finishing line. I mean, I knew she'd done well, but I don't think she knew just how well she'd done. But yeah, she felt it.
Yeah. Well, I was having a conversation with a friend earlier who said that they were having a hard time for all these reasons. And they were sort of saying there was things about themselves that they didn't like. And I'm not going to share too much of it because it's their personal business. But I basically said to them, I said, what you need to do is you need to think of something that would be crazy to do that probably doesn't, that you think that you can't physically do it. And then you need to go out and do it. Yeah. And you just need to prove, you need to do that. You need to feel that you're probably being slightly reckless and maybe taking more risks and is sensible. And you need that anxiety where you're sort of like unsure about whether you can do it. And then at the end of it, when you're finished, then you'll see who you really are. And you'll know, you'll probably feel better about yourself. Yeah. It's
I did that with when the running was becoming painful. A friend of ours did the Great North Swim in Windermere. 1 mile swim in open water, which doesn't sound a lot.
I bet it's cold.
It's pretty chilly. You have to wear a wetsuit. I think now they've made it so that you don't. I stopped doing it when John West Tuna started sponsoring it, so I've not done it for a while. But I saw her do the Great North Swim, and I thought to myself, I couldn't do that. So I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
So the following year I did it, and I think I did it 3 times. And it wasn't easy. But what was annoying was the fact that various injuries have meant that I can't do front crawl.
Yeah.
I just can't move I can't get my arm as I rotate it close enough to my ear to actually create forward momentum. I just end up flapping around from side to side in the water. So I've always had to do breaststroke. And the problem I've got with breaststroke is it doesn't propel you through the water quick enough to counteract the fact that I've got so much metal in my leg on the left-hand side of my body. So I ended up sinking, ended up bobbing like a fishing float, which is not great. So I stopped doing that. But yeah, I think that set yourself a challenge and do it. Claire's been very good at that over the years. And she's achieved a lot doing that. And I think my days of physical challenges are probably about over.
Apart from the one last marathon.
Yeah, will it ever happen? Who knows? It could happen. I'd like it to be. If it does, I want it to be London.
Yeah.
I'll probably shed a tear when I cross the line because I know it's probably been my last time doing something like that. But yeah, I think my days of being fit are well and truly behind me. I'm not a young man anymore. I'm certainly not old. I'm 50. I'm 51 next month.
Yeah, but your body's been through a lot, hasn't it?
My body's pretty knackered. It's but it's still there.
Yeah.
I'm still vertical. I said that so many times last year with people asking me how I was. I'm still vertical. I'm still ticking over. I still take a bit of stopping, I think that's, excuse me, that's the best way I can put it. I'll still reach ramming speed. It just takes me a bit longer to get there, and I just can't hang on to it for as long.
Well, this is one of the things that I spoke about with Claire when she was on about the strengthening power of adversity and how going through difficult things. And interestingly, since then, I was reading a book, this one, The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt, and he was basically, in it, he explores ancient wisdoms relating to happiness and looks at the scientific evidence for them and tries to connect the two. And one of them was the Nietzsche's "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," and so he was looking at the research on adversity and things like that, and it varies quite a lot, the impact based on age groups, but it basically showed that between about 15 and 25, having difficult experiences in your life is very, very positive. Like, it has a huge impact on developmental growth. It does after that as well. For below 15, you sort of single instances don't have a good or a bad effect, really.
Yeah.
But you don't want to be around constant adversity because then it'll stunt your growth and your development. But it was really interesting to read the research behind the idea that going through adversity, because he basically started with if you could read a script of your child's life in advance and had the option to edit it, you would probably try and edit out all the difficult and adverse experiences that they go through, because that's our natural sort of instincts. And it was basically like, actually, those might be the experiences that give them the ability to do other things. And this is, for me, has always been part of my, well, no, I would say always, since I've sort of got into these
excuse me,
endurance sports, like my long distance hiking and running and these things to really test myself physically, it's always the thing that spurs me on. Is every time I do it, I'm like, wow, like, I can't believe I did that. Like, you get a real buzz off of it. And one of the interesting things I found out, I actually knew this before, but I've forgotten it. I'd forgotten it when I was speaking with Claire, because I was explaining to her the difference between type 1 and type 2 fun. I don't know if you've heard that before, but type 1 is basically immediate gratification. So things like going out and drinking or doing something really fun. Type 2 fun is something that you don't necessarily enjoy it while you're doing it, but afterwards you're sort of like, I can't believe I did that. And it's something that sticks with you for a long period of time. And actually, on a neurobiological level, the dopamine production, which is our reward system in our brain, is connected with our pain receptors, and so basically they try and find an equilibrium for your normal sort of state. And what happens is if you have something like alcohol or most drugs are very good, and phones, like I was mentioning earlier, give you an immediate hit of dopamine. And that's what we enjoy about them, because it's like you're getting an instant reward. But then as your brain tries to achieve equilibrium, it leans towards the pain and suffering sort of receptors. And so what happens is you go up and then you go down and then you slowly work your way back up. But the reverse is true as well. So if you go through, like if say you're running a marathon and you go through that experience of the suffering, you're in pain, your body's under a lot of stress and things like that, then your brain, your pain pleasure sort of receptor is very much leaning towards pain, and then you finish and it goes and it tries to reach equilibrium, so it goes straight over to pleasure. You're getting loads of dopamine, but because it's got, your brain's done that itself rather than being artificially forced into it, it stays up there and it slowly works its way back down. And that's why you get a more satisfying, longer enjoyment out of something that makes you suffer than you do out of something that is immediately pleasurable.
Instant peak.
So I'm curious, because I wanted to speak about several things that happened in your army career that have come up over the years. But I'm curious because you mentioned it earlier. Have you seen the stuff recently about the RAF? Over the last few, has it been a week, maybe 2 weeks? My concept of time isn't brilliant, but there was someone, I can't remember a role, but they basically quit the RAF because the RAF had been given diversity targets to hit. And so they had been preferentially hiring ethnic minorities and women. And this person quit basically saying that they had effectively stopped hiring white men to try and hit diversity targets. Which to me was just insane. I like the idea that a hiring policy should be based on skin color or gender seems somewhat regressive to me. Had you heard about that?
No, I hadn't heard about it. But it's something I can understand and I appreciate, having spent time in the forces. Whilst the three services, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, are very different in some respects, very, very similar in others. Very, very similar in others. And the whole diversity side of things, I mean, the armed forces I was in was not diverse. It was not diverse. Whether it was it wasn't ethnically diverse. It wasn't diverse in equality amongst genders. It wasn't diverse in any way, really. It was, you fitted into the army. You were made to fit, and if you didn't fit, you had a very, very rough time. It's the old thing about you never decide what your nickname is.
Well, I've never been in a situation where people like it when someone chooses their own nickname.
A regiment I was with for a while were investigated by Roger Cook. I don't know if you remember Roger Cook.
No.
Journalist. I mean, the Cook Report was a program on telly. It was basically where he would investigate certain things. Great big fat guy. And he came out to the regiment I was with when we were in Cyprus. I remember seeing this huge figure walking along, and I got shouted at by, I think it was probably the regimental sergeant major, told me to go and tag on to this guy and take him somewhere. I think he'd take him to maybe the commanding officer's office, which I did. And then he told me to go and take an envelope with a piece of paper in it to somebody else. And that was basically an instruction to pass a message out amongst the regiment, because we didn't know this guy was coming.
Yeah.
But they realised that it was all to do with racism. And what ended up happening was the regiment was basically, it was decided that Roger Cook would film a parade on the square, which was a troop of white soldiers being shouted at and ordered about by a black sergeant whose nickname was Sooty.
Yeah.
But obviously that was never mentioned. And to show that, the idea of that was to show just how unracist and fair the regiment was, and that all the rumours that had been reported to Roger Cook or to his producers that they'd picked up on weren't true. So, yeah, it wasn't great. It wasn't great. You fitted in. The army didn't accommodate other opinions, other views.
That is so that there's two things to that. One is, there is always going to be one of the reasons I don't like this forced diversity thing is because you can't force people to change their beliefs.
No.
And so when you force it, it's sort of like, oh look, we've got a perfect mix of every different color, and it's like, but everyone sort of resents the fact that they're doing it, and so like it to me, it's like, what does it achieve if people are sort of like, we're doing this just to show you we're doing it, but none of us actually believe it? And to me, that tends to, in my experience, when people feel like they're doing something to appease others rather than because they want to do it, then people tend to resent it, and it makes things worse.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of sociological and psychological literature about the fact that when you place such a significant emphasis on difference, that people tend to section off into groups, and there's more tension between them. Whereas if you focus on their sort of commonality, like, we're all soldiers, then that then people tend to get along, and you have a lot more cohesion between them. So it fundamentally seems like the wrong way to go about things to try and force it. I also think that when you make it a quota, it becomes impossible to employ people without doing it on the basis of skin colour. And, this isn't... I've spoken to a number of black people about this over the years, and the opinion has, by and large, been, I wouldn't want to get a promotion or a job from somewhere that had a quota, because then I would feel like I don't know if I've earned my post, and everyone else is going to be questioning it as well, because nobody wants to be a diversity hire, because it undermines their people want people who are hired on merit, and people want to be hired on merit. And so putting quotas in place just seems really counterproductive to me.
But my old director of music, because I joined as a military musician. I ended up doing other bits and pieces, but one of my old directors of music was a chap called John Huggins. And ordinarily you start out as a bandmaster of what's a regimental band. And then in 1994 it all changed. All the regiments lost the bands, and the bands became bigger. They were divisional bands, which meant instead of being a bandmaster being in charge, you had a director of music. So instead of a warrant officer being in charge of the band, it was a captain, at least a captain, that was in charge of the band. John Huggins was the first black bandmaster of the Cheshire Regimental Band, the Cheshire Regiment, and he became the first black director of music in the British Army. And I remember so many people that were saying that he'd got the job because of that. Yeah, that it was the Army's attempt.
I can't imagine in '94 that the Army were hiring on that basis.
What they neglected to bear in mind was that he was actually, and as far as I'm aware, still is, an exceptionally talented musician.
Yeah,
he was incredibly good at what he did. And I just think it was unfortunate that ever became a thing. That it was ever considered that there's some levelling up was being done.
Yeah.
But I totally get what you're saying about the minute you put a number on it, it then has to be achieved. And how do you achieve it? You have to force it. You have to.
Yeah, I mean, this is
take away the merit side of things.
So yeah, one of the targets that I saw when I was reading about this RAF thing was that they wanted 20. I think it was 20% women, and I was like, but what if you don't get 20%? You know, what if 1/5 of all applicants aren't women, or what if 1/5 of people who want to do it? And like, from everyone I've spoken to in the army, people don't care whether the person next to them's a man or a woman. They care if the person next to them can do their job, and they're happy to have a woman next to them as long as she can carry what she needs to. Yeah. She can, you know, do everything that's required of her. And the fact of the matter is, although these are facts that are controversial to say now, there are some differences between men and women. And you know, there's psychological literature on that is quite clear, and there's evolutionary reasons why that would be. The biggest differences are in agreeableness. Women are slightly more agreeable, and neuroticism. Women are slightly more neurotic on average. And this is true cross-culturally, and it's more true in the countries that have done the most to make things more equal.
Right.
So that suggests it's innate rather than socially constructed. But neuroticism is like sensitivity to negative emotion, so it might be like anxiety.
There's quite a negative association with the word neurotic.
Yeah, but it's just in personality, it's just a word to describe a spectrum, which is like sensitivity to negative emotion. It's sort of like risk sensitivity as well. And agreeableness, disagreeable people are quite difficult. Again, it's a spectrum, and everyone. They're normative distributions, so most people sit somewhere in the middle. But because women are slightly higher on both those spectrums, what you tend to find is that while most men and women are somewhere in the middle, the extremely disagreeable people are like 90% men, and the extremely agreeable people are like 90% women. And it's the same with neuroticism. And so those don't give you any guidance on how you should interact with a person who's an individual, but they suggest that when it plays out across a society, that slight differences on those spectrums mean that people are going to be attracted to different roles more on average. And so the idea that you're going to get a perfect 20% of the army being female applicants is very, very unlikely. And I think, like, when I was away training recently, we were separated into 4 sections of 12, and one section had 2 women and the other 3 had 1. So we had 5 women out of 40 something. So it's not 20%, but it's about 10% or something like that. But that's just the number of people that are coming through, because that's like your initial training. And so that's fine. And I'm all for getting rid of barriers to people's inclusion where they can be identified and they exist, because I think people should be able to do what they want and apply for whatever jobs they want, so long as they're capable and they're able to do the job. And like, I've got no issue with that. My issue is with when you try and force it, because I think when you try and force it, it has a negative impact. You instantly have to sacrifice merit, because you have to, because you're having to judge based on whether they meet a certain other quota, because that criteria has become the priority, and you are disadvantaging that person, because they had the same thing in with university admissions, where they set quotas for diversity, and they pumped loads of ethnic minority pupils into schools where they had lower scores than the average scores required for entry. And what happened is the dropout rate was massively increased, because they felt out of place, because they weren't intellectually at the same level as the people around them. And it's not that they weren't intellectually there because of the colour of their skin, it's that they weren't intellectually there, but they'd been forced there because of the colour of their skin. But people often argue for these things like it's somehow helping, but if you look at the statistics for educational attainment,
it's an incredibly difficult thing to achieve. I think in there's far more to it than just bumping up the numbers. You can't just do that because, as you've just been talking about, it has a knock-on effect. I think it's a psychological change that needs to happen rather than a numerical change. I think that's what's required.
Yeah, and I think that I think that the best way to go about that is to base things on merit, so that the best people are doing the best thing regardless of who they are, and to get unifying identities that don't focus on race or gender and things like that. Like, we don't do this so much in England compared to how they do it in America, but America has a very sort of attitude of once you live here, you're American and you're striving and things like that, whereas we tend to stay, I guess maybe to some degree it's because we've embraced the sort of idea of multiculturalism, of having multiple cultures living independently of one another side by side, which doesn't seem to lead to cohesion from everything that I've looked into it. Whereas if you have a unifying identity, like I'm all for an idea that anyone who comes here who's a citizen, who is working, contributing, who's part of the society, is part of England, but we seem to not create that idea, and we see everyone as separate, and that to me but then the way we seem to be trying to handle that separation is to really emphasize the existence of that separation, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think it's a cultural thing that's built up over centuries. I think we as a nation are, generally speaking, the very best and the very worst when it comes to people from foreign countries. I think it brings out the very best in us. I think it brings out the very, very worst too. We have expectations as a nation when we go abroad. We're very often very unwilling to allow people to have those same expectations when they come here. I think that's a huge subject. Huge subject, and one that I have very little in the way of answers to offer. I think the only thing I can offer on that really is maybe 50 years of life experience and an awful lot of travelling when I was younger. But in terms of diversity, we've got it at the moment, haven't we? In terms of the latest focus on people coming into this country, some of the things I've heard in terms of migrants coming into this country, whether they're from Ukraine or whatever. I mean, I had an incident not that long ago. We were at the Rock and Bike Festival over at Alfreton, and one of the retailers there was selling the most appalling stickers and badges. Just disgusting messages on these stickers and badges about people coming into this country. I challenged him on it. I couldn't let it go.
Yeah.
I said, I can't believe you're selling these. And his answer was, well, I can't believe I've got any left. Actually, his shelves were full. I don't think he'd sold very many.
Yeah.
And I think that was a really good example of I really hope it's the minority. But this business of migrants coming and they've got their hands out. Well, I think it says an awful lot about the people who believe that. I think it says far more about them and maybe their dissatisfaction with themselves, with their own status and the way they are. And what do? We look for an easy target. And I think an awful lot of the time people have no concept whatsoever as to what life is like for these people.
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated issue because in my experience, there's been a reluctance on the right to acknowledge the sort of the humanity aspect and the compassionate aspect, and there's been a reluctance on the left to acknowledge that unbridled immigration isn't inherently a positive. because the left sort of tend to have a axiomatic belief that immigration is always good, and they have. This is part of. I mean, this goes back to our sort of discussion around social media and the impact it has on discourse. But like for example, the Brexit debate. Now, there were a lot of good reasons why people might object to the EU, but the main narratives we were given by those sort of campaigning for it were very unclear. There was sort of, promises of lots of money, but no real clear answers as to where that was going to come from. Although I was reading about that recently, and apparently it's not as clear cut, because there's a big thing about people saying we were lied to by a bus, and it's, to me, there's just a element of smugness to that's like people saying, oh, look at all the British people, they're stupid, and it just that sort of stuff gets my back up. And apparently part of the process of Brexit is like there's a transition period that's going to last 7 or 8 years, so we're not at the point where that money will become available yet anyway, so it's unclear as to how much that money will be available. But what I saw from the Remainers was they went, well, everyone who disagrees with us must be a racist, and that's the extent of our argument. And I was like, well, that's not going to win an argument. And
no, there has to be balance. There has to be consideration for whether you agree with it or not. You have to be able to try and work out why people are thinking what they're thinking, and why to them that is the most important argument. Otherwise, you can't hope to have a sensible discussion with them. Otherwise, it's like arguing with somebody that isn't there.
Yeah.
If there is an inability to explain and to reason with, you can't have that discussion with people. So whilst I don't hold a great deal of faith in things like the star signs and people being very stereotypical of their star signs, I'm a stereotypical Libran.
Yeah,
I try and be balanced. Doesn't mean I agree with everybody. I don't. And I'm very often the first one to call people names, whether they deserve it or not, and generalise. But I try and be very balanced. And I think you've got to understand why people say what they say. And with people like Boris Johnson, it's very simple. Boris Johnson, he basically wants to run a cult. He wants to promise people things as long as they do things a certain way.
I got the impression he was very... See, there were some points over COVID and that where I felt like there were glimpses. Like there was one point where he was talking about us going back into lockdown. He was clearly very reluctant about it, and it was clear to me from the way he spoke about it that he was concerned about unnecessarily limiting people's freedoms. And I was like, oh my God, you were getting a glimpse into this humanity side. But I get the impression that he was very much at the whim of everyone around him and would just sort of do what people wanted him to. Like he didn't seem like he had a lot of backbone,
maybe I'm
or
a bit
like
more
a
cynical.
Structured belief in himself.
I feel a bit more cynical about it. I think his main worry was because he's so controlled by big business, and lockdown inhibited business, inhibited the economy. Well, and I think he was worried about how that would be perceived, and I think he was worried about getting a spanking, really.
See, I think that a lot of people interpret concern for the economy as concern for big business. But I've been... I decided recently that I didn't know enough about economics, and so I've been learning about economics. Subject. And it's a big, complicated subject. Yeah. But the one thing that's become very apparent is that when the economy gets worse, the first people to suffer are the people at the bottom.
Yeah.
And, one of the... If you look at the sort of... When the economy starts to shrink, when the economy suffers... I mean, we're still dealing with the consequences of lockdown to a significant degree and the impact on the economy. But the fact that we weren't producing anything means that and the profits decrease means that businesses start to close down, people lose jobs, everything becomes more expensive because when you're producing less of stuff, there's less supply, therefore the price goes up. And that's, and you see lots of these impacts now. And sometimes, and this to me, one of the other things I've been reading about recently is morality and the basis for morality. It's trying to bridge the gap between the left and the right. And generally, both sides have a desire to be moral. They just have different conceptualizations of what that looks like. And the left are very based on care and compassion. There's sort of this moral foundations theory has 6 different foundations of morality, whereas the right tend to draw on a wider variety of them, whereas the left tend to sacrifice a lot of the other, like loyalty, divinity. I'm trying to remember what the other ones are. Liberty, oppression. I think there's another one that the left did do a bit on, to be fair, but it was primarily on the care ethic. And I think what I see quite often, I particularly saw it with COVID as a really clear example, is the left side of the spectrum where, like, there's a threat, it's the government's responsibility to protect as many people as possible and to minimise the damage that's done in the here and now. Whereas the right was sort of going, well, there's trade-offs here, and there's questions, there's difference in the view of the role of government, because the left tend to favour a lot more government roles, whereas the right tend to view things as community and charity sort of responsibilities rather than government. It's a small government, big government thing. But there was the right argument, right as in right wing, not right as in correct, argument, as far as I could tell, was more, we want to save people and protect people, but we have a number of trade-offs that we'll be making in those terms, and one of them is how much are we going to damage people in the long run. Whereas, so it seemed to be a question of timescale to me to some degree, whereas the left seemed to be very focused on the here and now, deal with this, whereas the right were a bit like, how does this play out over a longer term, which is interesting because you sort of see the opposite happen to some degree with environmentalism and the sort of climate change stuff. The left are very like, we need to do everything here and now to deal with what's going to happen in the long term, whereas the right are like, well, while you're focusing on the long term, your policies are doing damage here and now. So it's not necessarily that either side thinks in terms of timescale, but just on different issues they seem to go on different issues. But
when's your birthday, Robin?
May 21st.
I see, you're thinking like a Libran here. You're seeing the balance. You're seeing both sides.
Yeah. So I'm on the cusp of Taurus and Gemini, but
I have no idea what those characteristics are.
Taurus is stubborn. Gemini are something else. I don't know.
I have to say, I mean, I see an awful lot of why the Tory party want to do things a certain way, and I can see the reasoning in why they want to do things a certain way. I still cannot bring myself to think like a Tory. Yeah.
Well, and this is, I'm quite good at getting myself to think like other people. It's sort of a large part of my job, you know. Like I'm very good at reading people and putting myself in their shoes and trying to see things from their perspective. I wasn't as good at it when I was younger, particularly when I was like really activisty, because I'd sort of bought into this narrative that the world was made up of good and evil, which I no longer believe. And one of the things I've learned over recent years is to put myself in the shoes of people who I've spent my entire life disagreeing with. And, you know, I was sort of raised on narratives of Tories are evil and they just hate people and it's all about self-interest and things like that. And then I grew up, met more conservatives, read more of their perspectives. It was like, it's not about that at all. It's two different perspectives, and actually, generally, both sides have an idea of good that they're aiming for, and just different ways to achieve it. And it's not ever that clear who's right on a given issue, or like you can't say one of them's right universally. Like there are some things that I think the Conservatives get right more than the Labour, and there are some things I think Labour get right more than the Conservatives.
It comes down to you yourself, what your view of morality is, what your view of what society should be, what your view of what humanity is, and that I think is what colours your opinion of whether or not you dislike the Tories. I happen to dislike the Tory party, but it doesn't mean I can't appreciate why they, or understand why they do things a certain way. I just happen to believe that it's an unpleasant way to go about things. But that's again a huge subject, and one that maybe I don't have the intellect to be able to explain my views properly. I think I just feel a certain way, and I feel community is more important. I've worked for a bank. I worked for Barclays Bank for some time. I hated every minute of it because it was striving for wealth for everybody connected to the bank, for the shareholders, for yourself. You know, when you're commission paid in a fiscal institution like that, it's unhealthy. It's unpleasant and it's unhealthy. But again, there may be people who were very good at the job, who brought lots of money in for themselves. They brought lots of money in for the bank. Consequently, the shareholders stood more chance of getting payouts. And if money made them happy, then money made them happy, and it was a good thing.
Well, it's also that the more money comes into a bank, the more money they're able to loan out to get businesses started. It creates more economic activity, which benefits everyone in the long run.
Yeah, but having been in the position I was in, I can tell you that is not necessarily the way it works. The more money comes into the bank, the more they pay out to the shareholders.
Yeah,
that's the basic. It was all target led. It was all about getting the most money out of every single banking customer, maximising, manipulating, almost brainwashing every customer to think in a certain way, so that you could then analyse the way they went about their business, the way they went about their lives, and maximise the money you got from them.
This is where
ruthless. I hated it.
This is one of the. I mean,
it's that word, morality. It's what your view of morality is.
Yeah, but it's again, it's where the focus is, because banks, despite their negative reputation, there's this thing that happens quite a lot. And it's played a big part in loads of ethnic divisions throughout history, where people feel an instinctive dislike towards roles in society that they can't immediately see the benefit of. And the Jews suffered from this immensely, because they were famously played the role of the middleman in a lot of places they went. So they would connect people with other people to get trades, and they would take a profit from that. Their role as a middleman wouldn't exist were that not needed to connect people, but people would go, well, we could just trade with each other, so why have we got a middleman? You're just taking money out of it. And this has been part of the reason. I mean, Thomas Sowell's done a good job. He's a economic historian, and he's gone through numerous situations throughout history in different countries where different minority groups have played middleman roles, and they always sort of end up attracting the wrath of other people, but these people weren't trading beforehand. And sometimes it's like, if there are tribal tensions within a country and then an immigrant community comes in that doesn't have any loyalties to either side, then they're able to commune between the two different tribes and facilitate trade. And that means that everyone's getting more of what they want, and this person is getting a reward for their services, because they're providing a function that is worth that much to people, because otherwise people wouldn't pay them for it. And banks are very good because if you think about sort of back to the origins of banks and how they started up, and I am not in favor. I'm in favor of some restrictions, not some restrictions, but some regulation on banks to ensure that they're following certain standards to make sure that they're not exploiting people, and so on. But I think their function would be that basically, say I've got money that I don't need at this point in time, £1,000. I put it into the bank. Someone comes along and is like, I desperately need some money right now so that I can get stock for my business or something like that. Can I borrow 100? I'll pay you back 120 next month once I've sold the stock, because I'll have made it. And £100 is worth more to me now than £120 is next month. So the bank goes, well...
It's a banking phrase, present value of money.
Mm-hmm.
That's a banking phrase.
Present value of money.
Present value of money.
Yeah, because money changes value over time. And that's, we've got a massive issue with inflation at the moment. And that's because the value of money is decreasing. Therefore, it takes more money to get stuff. But obviously, wages and everything don't grow in the same time as inflation. So our real value of our money goes down. Economics is very interesting, but very boring.
It's a subject that I remember doing economics at school. I had an amazing economics teacher. His name was Cess Thompson. Guy was the first black rugby league player for Great Britain. He was an orphan. Taught himself to read and write at night school. Started a window cleaning business, became very successful. Went on to become a housemaster, a head of department to an old-fashioned grammar school in Chesterfield. Bit of a local legend. It's a great book. Cess Thompson, C-E-C, that's how you spell Cess. He wrote a book called Born on the Wrong Side.
Yeah.
And he was a terrific teacher, but I was terrible at economics. Because it's so vast and it's so all-encompassing and it affects so many other things. The knock-on effect, the domino effect. It's the old, the butterfly flaps its wings and...
Yeah.
I couldn't perceive that. Well, certainly not then. And now I've got so many other things happening in my brain. I don't want to... It's a subject I don't really know a great deal about, other than what I've gathered over my lifetime. But I don't know. As far as banking is concerned and economics and things like that, the example I always come back to in terms of present value of money or money in hand and being a successful business person is, it was put to me, Tesco and Cornflakes. Tesco gets supplied with cornflakes. Let's use a brand, Kellogg's. They buy Kellogg's cornflakes by the lorry load, by the container load, by the shipload. And these things come in and they go on the shelves and they sell them. For argument's sake, £1 a box.
Yeah.
I've no idea what cornflakes cost these days.
Way more than that.
It's a small box.
Yeah.
And that £1, they get that £1 straight away.
Yeah.
And all those cornflakes, all those Kellogg's cornflakes on the shelves are sold pretty quickly. They restock the shelves.
Yeah.
Now, ordinarily, you supply something to somebody, you invoice them for it, and you decide the terms as to when you get paid, 28 days being the most common.
Yeah.
I do it when I create an invoice or a contract for when I'm putting a band into going out for a gig, when I get booked, and I determine when we're going to get paid. And people are obliged to pay by that time. Otherwise, I am legally allowed to charge a certain amount of interest over the Bank of England base rate for every day they don't pay me. Tesco have put themselves in a position where it's not 28 days. Sometimes it's 6 months. They don't pay their suppliers for 6 months. But they've made their profit thousands of times over on all these shipments of cornflakes that have gone on the shelf. It's incredible. 6 months later, they pay for that first box of Kellogg's cornflakes that they sold. But in their bank account, has gone through their bank account is all the millions and millions of pounds for all the boxes of cornflakes that they've sold that they don't pay for 6 months.
Well, without knowing the specifics of their contract, the specific details, it's very hard to sort of make a judgment on it. But I would guess one thing they'll buy in bulk because economies of scale mean that. So the phrase that Thomas Sowell uses to describe economics, which to me was like the most useful, simple phrase for understanding it, is it's the allocation of scarce resources with other uses. And that's basically what it's about, is where can we get the most efficient use of our resources? And so if they're getting cornflakes in bulk, that's because it's cheaper to produce them, it's cheaper to ship them, all in that mass. And so we're using less oil, we're using, because there's less trips, less of all of these things that are involved in it, less labour. It makes it easier, and we are getting more food for less resource. Food's pretty essential for living. Yeah. Although Tesco have their own brand cornflakes, which are a lot cheaper and taste exactly the same.
Probably less than £1.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, probably more than £1 now. Part of the reason for any contract and the timescales of payment is based on trust and reputation and relationship with that supplier. So if you go to a new supplier who, if you have a big brand and you're known for paying your invoices and things like that, then you might get away with it. But I couldn't go into Tesco, for example, and go,
no, you don't get to negotiate.
I'll pay you for Tesco. I'll pay you for these cornflakes next week because
point of sale.
Because Tesco have millions of customers. They know nothing about their customers beyond what their club card says, really, and they can't keep track of it. So there's no way they could trust people to pay them back. If Tesco have been paying that person paying the same supplier for cornflakes for the last 20 years and have never missed a payment, then they have room to negotiate because there's a trusting relationship built up there.
They're in a very, very powerful position. But, the point I'm making is, how many boxes of cornflakes can Tesco sell in 6 months before they need to pay for that one first shipment?
Yeah.
They're not paying for 6 months' worth. But they're paying for that one first shipment,
they might have reasons that their cash flow runs on a 6 month cycle because they're having to maintain high levels of stock for different things, and this is where it gets really complicated.
A friend of ours developed, in conjunction with another bakery, with a non-vegan business. They developed vegan brioche buns, which ended up in Tesco.
I didn't know Tesco had started doing vegan brioche buns. I knew Aldi had, but I haven't seen Tesco.
They stopped selling them for whatever reason. Now, I've not spoken to this particular friend about why that may have been. But I remember at the time, when they first got into the local Tesco's, I remember him talking about the payment terms which they were forced on them. And when they got this fantastic product, packaging, the marketing was, the visual product was superb, tasted stunning, but they didn't know if they could actually maintain business because the payment terms, the invoicing terms that Tesco foisted on them were so brutal that they had to then go and get loans to afford to be able to produce this so that they could then supply the biggest retailer in the country. Now, where that went to and what happened, I've no idea. I don't know. It's not a subject I've ever discussed with them since.
Yeah.
But it is quite simply, it's just a case of the present value of money means power, fiscal power. And if you've got say a shipment of cornflakes is 1,000 boxes, and that is sold in 3 days.
Yeah.
6 months down the line, you're paying for that first shipment. But you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other shipments that you've not paid for. But you've still sold all those cornflakes, and you've still got those billions of bloody pounds in your pocket.
But when you think about, so they've got to pay for the cornflakes, they've got to pay for the storage of the cornflakes, they've got to pay for the
Well, they
staff
don't.
to sell them.
But you see, this is the thing. They don't really have to pay for the storage because there is things like cornflakes. It's such a turnover. It's such a turnover of products of that particular product that there is very little in the way of storage. It comes in and it goes out.
Well, but it depends. So what they will they will probably do is they'll do it store by store, and obviously a smaller Tesco will keep less stock at any one time, and they'll have warehouses somewhere that are shipping. So they'll keep their warehouses stocked to a certain degree and then keep them rotating in the thing. So they are paying for storage. They're doing more transportation with themselves. They've got to pay for staff. They've got to pay for ground rent. They've got to pay for bills. But that's all within
reason. That's all within reason.
Yeah, like they're making a huge profit overall, but per box of cornflakes, Tesco will probably only be making like 5% profit.
Many years ago, when I first, I did one or two jobs when I first left the forces, and prior to actually setting out as a full-time professional musician, I needed to make ends meet.
Yeah.
I had a young family at the time, and I stacked shelves at Tesco. I did it for about 3 months. Even when I was, in conjunction with working as a musician, because I'd taken out a business loan and I needed to get myself in a position where I could not just make ends meet, but actually put all the pieces into place so that my family could exist. And there were certain companies that would deliver. It would be them that delivered to the Tesco stores. It wouldn't be a Tesco distributing lorry that turned up. These companies would come and they'd come straight from the back of the lorry, straight onto the shop floor, and straight into people's homes. Breakfast cereals were one of those. Certain brands of bread, certain things. They're just in and out, and it's the finances behind this. The amount of money that is generated in that way of something that sells so quickly, just being so brutal as to say, this is when we're going to pay you. No, this is when we're paying you. We've told you, this is when you will get your money. And very often they don't. It'll take even longer. But because they've got this company in this cycle of supply, there's nothing they can do about it. And it's big business. I mean, it's just something that's stuck in my mind. It was an analogy that was put to me when I first worked for Barclays. I joined the business finance arm of Barclays, Barclays Mercantile it was called, selling finance to farmers. But we were taught to read a balance sheet, a profit and loss account, so that we could actually examine the finances of the companies that we were selling finance to. The guy that taught us was a fascinating chap. I can't even remember his name now, but he gave us this analogy of the cornflakes. And he started to put some numbers to it. He'd actually got the information.
Yeah.
I cannot remember what the numbers involved were, but it was stunning. It was jaw-droppingly huge just for cornflakes. And it was cornflakes that he used the example of. I couldn't comprehend running a business like that. I couldn't do it. I worked for one of the biggest banks on the market, which was Barclays. I ended up as a bank manager. Strangely, I did it through the back door by fibbing. What do you know about banking? Oh, I know lots. And it was that ridiculous. And I got in through the back door from the business finance arm into the main banking side of things. Having worked for a huge organisation like Barclays with some enormous agricultural businesses that have got £50 million overdrafts, it's numbers I can't comprehend. That word that you used earlier, morality, was a huge part of why I don't do that anymore. I can't do it. My first week in the job within the main bank was when foot and mouth hit.
Yeah.
And I had to call in the debts. I had to go and knock on the door and hand deliver envelopes to these farmers who had been hit by foot and mouth, calling in the debts that Barclays Bank had manipulated these people into having. I had 5 in my first week to visit. 3 of those 5 shot themselves. 2 of them actually, killed themselves. One guy just took a big chunk of his scalp off, and ended up. I think he was fine in the end in terms of his physically he was okay. But as far as he was concerned, he'd let his whole family down, his generations of his farming family down. And
it's an industry with quite a high suicide rate, farming.
It's an industry with a high suicide rate, but it's also an industry which, if you looked at it, I mean, the lending criteria for a lot of businesses requires certain assurances. You need to look at the money that's going in, the money that's coming out, what future things may affect that business. For the farming industry, the vast majority of loans and overdrafts are secured on land and buildings. The machinery, the crops and everything, they come and go. But the land stays, which is hence the old phrase, land is king. So the businesses, some appalling businesses, were being lent millions of pounds. I was underwriting pea viners, big, huge machines that strip the peas from the plants. I don't know, £300,000-400,000 machinery.
Yeah, all the equipment on farms.
Carrot harvesters. These things that dig the carrots up, wash them, size them, bag them. Incredible pieces of machinery, and I was financing those to businesses that had no right to have, to take on all this debt. Shouldn't have done it, but
you've got to think from the bank's perspective. It's very hard for me to imagine that they're just going to loan loads of equipment that they'll never get payments back on, because that's a really terrible business model. They have to have some assurance that they're going to get it back, so they must have a criteria, because it's not in their interest to constantly be writing checks for $500,000 and then never getting payments back on them.
Well, they did to secure things on the land. But I mean, the other thing that happened was, I try to remember exactly how this used to work. Pre-1997, pre the Labour Party coming into power and Gordon Brown taking over as Chancellor, you had in business what were called your writing down allowances. And if you bought a piece of machinery, you could claim a certain percentage of that as against your tax bill. Yeah. And if you bought something a couple of weeks before your year end, your business year end, you could still claim the full allowance. It's called writing down allowances. Yeah. You could still claim that full amount against your tax bill in terms of your writing down allowances. That then changed when Labour came into power. And if you bought a piece of machinery, say 10 days before your year end, you could claim 10/365ths of it.
Okay, yeah. So everyone was buying everything on the 1st of April then.
So what happened? I mean, business changed and leasing became more of a thing. And Barclays Mercantile was actually made up of 366 individual companies. And every time on a particular day, each company was responsible for a particular day of the year.
One of them only had to work once every 4 years.
On paper. And that meant that Barclays Mercantile, a branch of Barclays, a separate company within the Barclays, under the Barclays umbrella, Barclays as a whole could claim the writing down allowances for every piece of machinery that they leased, that they financed a lease for, to the agricultural industry or to the business or to the to industry in general. So it wasn't a case of they were trying to do anything other than make money. Every single thing was engineered towards making the maximum amount of money from every single opportunity. So it wasn't a case of they wouldn't write these checks if they didn't think they were going to get it back. They would get their money back. It was there, the assurances were there, the security was there in terms of the land or whatever, but also they would do it in such a way that the risk wasn't theirs.
Yeah.
It wasn't their risk.
Well, that they would probably have some degree of insurance and things like that on it.
Yeah.
But it's still, an insurance company isn't going to insure them on it if their insurance company isn't making more money than they're going to be paying out. Because no one is going to have a business model where they spend more money than they earn, because that's how you end up broke. So, I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of the agricultural industry economics. It's a complicated business, but
it's changed so much. I mean, it'll be unrecognisable for me now compared to what it was. I mean, I was financing things like milk quota, which was the right to produce milk.
Yeah.
At a certain fat content. And if your cows produced too much milk and it was too rich, you couldn't sell it. The whole system was completely shafted, but we were financing this. And these poor farmers who were trying to stay afloat, were having money thrust at them in a certain way and put into their pockets in a certain way, which meant that they just kept ticking over, and bit by bit, the bank kept eating away at their assets.
Well,
more and more ink was going on, more and more bits of paper as to who owned those assets.
One of the things that I found out recently was that in Europe, across Europe, the subsidies for dairy farming are huge, and that keeps the price of dairy products about 3 times the market average for the rest of the world, which means that we produce a lot more milk than we have to.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's more financially viable than the market would determine it to be because of these subsidies. And so I was thinking, because at the moment we're facing a number of massive issues economically. One of them is that Russia's cut off all the gas and oil, which has sent the prices skyrocketing. And as we also have had a series of green policies over the last few years that mean that loads of countries like Canada, for example, that have access to large amounts of gas and oil haven't been accessing them. So instead of being able to balance that out, we just gave Russia the power to do that. So now what we need, if we want to counter because when the price of oil goes up, it messes up the price of everything, because packaging, fuel for transportation, like everything is reliant on oil. So the price of everything goes up. We also have Ukraine, was a massive exporter of grain. And
sunflower oil.
Sorry?
And sunflowers.
Yeah.
Sunflower oil.
So there's products that would be considered fairly essential to a lot of our products here are in shorter supply, so the price of them is going up as well. And then in Holland, you've had more green policies come in that have massively increased the cost to farmers and slowed down the rate of production. And Holland are the second biggest exporter of produce in the world. So there's a decrease in supply of vegetables and fruits, and the price of them is going up as well. So we're ending up with shortages of most of the essential products that we rely on. And what I was thinking when I was hearing about these subsidies was like, well, if we didn't pay subsidies to farmers to sustain overproduction of dairy beyond what we needed, then some of those dairy farmers would move towards grain or sunflower or something like that we currently need, because we need to drive the price down because the prices of those are quite high, and that'll be more profitable for the farmer. And so I think that obviously I'm not people there are many reasons why people sort of produce what they do and work in the way that they do. And I know with farming, a lot of it's lineage and sort of, you
habit.
That's
what the family have done.
I do think that there is, while I'm sure that there's unscrupulous tactics on the part of the bank, I think that if you have got a business model that means that there are things that are unpredictable as well, like there are weather events that mean, like, I'm sure that the southeast of England is going to be struggling for a harvest this year, which is just going to add to the probability of food shortages, which are a very real risk at the moment for a lot of the world. But that land could probably be put to better use, and the fact that they're not making enough money of it is the market basically saying, you're not doing the most efficient thing for what we need right now. And so it's a simplistic thing to say, again, because these things are really, really complicated. But I do think that sometimes, while I feel sorry for the farmers, I also feel that it's not as simple as to say the banks are being evil and the farmers are doing are the victims. To me, it's like there are multiple competing market forces, and everyone could probably be doing some things better.
It's the multi-pronged way of looking at things. You know, there's so many things that all focus in on a particular aspect of this discussion. You know, that in terms of the way the banks behave. Again, it's a subject that I don't have the knowledge to be able to offer solutions or to perhaps speak any further than my own personal experience and knowledge. And again, it's economics.
Yeah.
It's economics.
I definitely wasn't expecting us to go off on a half-hour tangent on economics.
I've no idea what the discussion was going to be. I mean, I came here with a very sort of open mind in terms of what we're going to end up talking on. But you know, economics is not my thing. But I've worn many hats in my life, and wearing the Barclays Bank one is not something I'm particularly proud of. But I learned a lot in the 2 years I worked for them. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
I would rather eat my own eyes than work for a bank again. I would rather drape my wet testicles over an electric fence than work for Barclays Bank or any bank or any financial institution again. It's just life. You know, your views in life change. I've had money. I grew up in very two sides to my family. You know, my father died when I was very, very young, and we were living in a house that belonged to the Church of England, and which we basically got kicked out of. My mum remarried when I was not much older, but I grew up with wealth on my grandparents' side, and one lot of grandparents, and other grandparents were living in a coal mining way of life. So I grew up with
not living in a coal mine.
Well, they lived right opposite the Bramley Vale drift mine, on literally right, within 100 yards of it. So I grew up without money, generally, but then I had money. I don't really have a pot to piss in these days, and that has shaped my way of thinking about things quite dramatically. It's changed my outlook on life. It's changed my ambitions, and I couldn't be further from the person that on paper I was when I worked for Barclays. I disliked working for Barclays. I enjoyed the £59,000 basic salary that I started on, and the I think my bonus, probably about 20% of that on top. I liked that.
Yeah.
Because that's the person I was then. But I couldn't do that now.
Well, there are other motivating factors other than money, aren't there? And money, all like that book that I was reading on happiness again was talking about the idea of sort of material satisfaction, making because there's this idea that rich people are happier, and he put a sort of thought experiment to you and was like, do you think that someone who's won the lottery and has £50 million to spend would be happier than a paraplegic, for example? And it's basically like, possibly slightly, but the research tends to indicate that while material benefits are beneficial, like they improve your happiness immediately, we adapt to them very, very quickly, and after a few months or so, then you tend to return to roughly your base level of happiness. And the things that the things that have the bigger effect on happiness are relationships. Having a healthy marriage is one of the greatest predictors of happiness. And one of the others is service to others. So when you are doing something, if you're volunteering, if you're working for a church organization, if you happen to have a job that serves other people, but different people find different meaning through different things. Like some people, I've been listening to a book by Ray Dalio, who was the head of Blackwater Investment Group.
Yeah.
And he saw his entire organization as like one big family, and he loved training people up and teaching them how it worked and getting hold of a problem and trying to solve it and getting everyone involved. And he talks a lot about he would use the term radical honesty, what was the idea? He always refers to sort of idea meritocracies, but he's very focused on sort of like, he loved the process and he loved doing it, and he's made billions, probably, well, certainly hundreds of millions. They're a huge investment firm. He's done really well, but he's also lost everything and had to rebuild it, and that's sort of the nature of it. But for him, a lot of it was doing the philanthropic work and finding where to put the money to most effectively make a difference. A lot of it was building something for his family. A lot of it was training other people up. So the money was a consequence of doing all of this. And there are some people who are motivated purely by money, but in my experience, and I've met some people who are very successful in that regard, and I've met a lot of people who haven't got very much, and the people who are very money focused in both sides of things tend to be in the minority, and money tends to be a secondary consequence of something else that they love. The people who are really good at it, and some people do find that making money does become their meaning, but yeah, they're in a minority, and those people who are very, very good at making money to that level tend to also help out other people, because they create businesses, they create opportunities for other people, and so I haven't met that many millionaires in my life. I've met a few, but not that many. But I've also watched a lot of interviews with millionaires, read some of their books, heard it, so I've had some insight into their ways of thinking and how they feel about things. And generally there is a enjoyment at being good at something, and there are a lot of other motivations to be doing some good. They see themselves as doing some good in some way, whether that's providing for their family or not. And there's a lot of them turn to philanthropic work later on in life, and there's been a number of cases with very, very rich people where they're not public about their philanthropic work, and then when they die, it comes out that they've been donating 70% of their salary to charity for God knows how many years, and just no one knew about it because it wasn't about the public attention. So it's
if I play the lottery tomorrow and I pop 10 million, you could ask me what I would spend it on, and I could tell you straight away. It would be on developing things and infrastructure to try and help more animals.
Yeah. Well, that's.
I might buy a new pair of shoes. I might buy a nicer car, but that would be of no consequence. That would be to perhaps the nicer car would be to reduce the worry of car breaking down. The new shoes might be to actually get some shoes that fit.
Yeah.
I've got very wide feet. Most of my shoes are uncomfy. There would be a reason why I would spend the money. But ultimately, what it would mean would be I could do more of what matters, and not have to worry about money. I have no interest in a bigger house. if I did buy a bigger house, it would be for a reason.
Yeah.
So we've got more rooms, so that in case more people bring us hedgehogs. But that would be why.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be so that I can say, look at my house. It's big. No.
No, there are reasons for, like, conspicuous consumption is, yeah. I'm probably on the fence with that slightly, because I like to buy nice things. I like to have nice things, and you know, like, my aim is I do want to have a nice house and a nicer car because I like to have nice things. But part of the reason I like to have nice things is I only want nice things to a certain degree. I want them to serve a function.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, like, I intend on having a family at some point. So I want a house that is a nice environment for me and my children to grow up in, and all of that, you know, with a garden for them to play in, good rooms that they can, like, and I would like to have a room that I can convert into a gym that's a little bit nicer than my current garage gym, which is dusty and a little bit cramped. But you know, I like my garage gym. But these
are pleasantries for you. These aren't things. They're not there to change the way you hope the world perceives you.
No, and to me, I guess the thing for me is that all of the money that I get comes as a consequence of trying to do something that I feel is making a difference, or something that I'm doing right. You know, like, I work in social care because I feel like it provides me with an opportunity to make a positive impact, largely. I'm sure that anyone who's listened to my podcasts will know how critical I am of social care, but I am reading and studying because I want to be able to contribute something to the ideas that help with understanding the world, and can build something if I can contribute to something in some way in that regard. You know, my long-term plan is to become a psychologist so I can help people, partially because I want to be able to work with people who want the help rather than people who are forced to by state intervention, which is why a large part of the reason why psychology appeals to me over social work. But all of my endeavours are based around wanting to help people. Even the podcast is largely about wanting to help people. So it was inspired, right? There's a selfish motivation for it as well. Of course there is. There's always a selfish motivation to things, but you know, I enjoy talking to people. I know a lot of interesting people with interesting stories. I find this format brings out some stuff that you wouldn't necessarily get in a normal conversation, like the sort of formal making time for it without distractions creates a different environment for it. But also I was like, I know a lot of interesting people with a wide variety of experiences that have some value and utility for other people to hear, and I would like to hear them, and I would like to share them with other people. And I don't know if you can see it, but I've got a list of books with different names next to them there. And the reason is that I have a new idea for what I'm going to do with the podcast that's about that's going to be largely based around discussing books with people, and the conversations that launch off of that. And that's about helping me to develop my understanding while helping other people to get an understanding of different subjects that I've been reading about, that I can talk to some degree, and to hopefully encourage and incentivize reading for other people and participation. So like, I have many things I do, and very few of them are purely for pleasure. I say martial arts is probably the closest thing I get to something that's purely for pleasure, and it's a questionable pleasure because it involves getting punched in the face quite a lot. But
I did it when I was younger, and it's I did it to try and learn how to stretch, so that because I did a lot of rock climbing. And I enjoyed the physical side of it, but the getting kicked and punched wasn't.
Which martial art did you do?
Shotokan karate.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I do a form of kung fu, Wing Chun.
Wing Chun.
Yeah. Um, I think that it goes beyond just sort of the pleasure of doing it though, because to me there's a lot you learn from it as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's something it teaches you sort of a respect and a discipline.
But you see, you're making the point now that like you said, the Wing Chun is for you, really.
Yeah.
And now you're just proving the point by explaining that it's not just about being an ace fighter. No, it's about sometimes, self-affirmation, about learning, about bettering yourself.
It's also humility, I think. You learn a lot of humility from martial arts.
Learn about yourself, you learn humility.
Yeah, because, I'm in my club at the moment. We've had a new person join recently, but post-COVID, because it was attached to a university, it was quite a big club with a lot of students, and they all disappeared over COVID. And then basically when we returned, it was all brown and black belts, and then me, who was like the new guy. So everyone was miles ahead of me.
Yeah.
And so I've just spent the last year getting my ass absolutely
you learn humility.
Me two times a week at least. And you have to learn to deal with it, because if you let your ego get the better of you and get upset, one, you'll just do stupid things that mean you lose more often.
But that's. I mean, you're qualifying it more and more now. You see, because it's not just being able to do something like that. Isn't just about portraying an image. It's not that. It's bettering yourself, or understanding yourself more, improving yourself more. I prefer the word improving rather than bettering. Because bettering implies that one thing is of more value than another. I think improving yourself is a better way to describe it. It's why I have no truck with religion as a whole, in terms of the mainstream religions such as Christianity and Islam. I see those as a cult, in as much as they make demands of you, they promise things. They dictate what you can and can't do. However, things like Buddhism, it's about understanding yourself and understanding your place in the world. I had the pleasure of meeting the Dalai Lama some years ago.
Did you?
Yeah. And he was fabulous. He was fabulous. One of the guys that I was stationed with the Gurkhas at the time. One of the Gurkhas that I was with, Lines Gurung. Tiny little chap, ferocious fighter, brilliant guy. Could do a Rubik's Cube in the blink of an eye. And the Dalai Lama had somehow found this out and produced a Rubik's Cube from out of his robes and sat down with Lines and asked him to show him how to do it. Show him how to do the Rubik's Cube. And I can't remember what the
Lines say, go on YouTube, mate. Anyone can learn.
Well, no, because the YouTube wasn't a thing then. We didn't have YouTube then. But his basic answer was that he wanted to have somebody show him how to do something that he wanted to do, and that was he was trying to improve a certain aspect of himself and an understanding, get a better understanding of himself and how he thought when it came to doing basic mundane things that were an achievement that meant nothing really in the grand scheme of things. And I think that way of self-improvement, what it brings is a satisfaction with your lot in life. And I'm not saying it means you stop, because it's a cliche, but it's a journey. It's not a destination. It's a constant thing.
Yeah.
But it brings a certain satisfaction with it and a certain clarity. Contentment may be a better word with your sort of lot and your way of going about things. I mean, the Dalai Lama has got incredible intellect, got an incredible sense of humour, but also an incredible humility as well. Just a really interesting way of looking at the world, and I think that's the way we should all be. I know that's probably opposite to maybe some aspects of what we've been discussing, that you need the right and the left, you need the yin, the yang.
Yeah.
But I just think, if one or two people maybe in the Tory party, maybe that idiot that has run it for so long that looks like he's combed his hair with a toffee apple, maybe if he just learnt to look at himself in a different way, maybe, just maybe, the world would be a different place at the moment, for this nation. I think if he was a little bit more introspective, a little bit more self-analysing, maybe we wouldn't be where we are now, about to get somebody like Liz Truss in power. But that's that's another discussion for another day, maybe.
Yeah, we actually haven't. I'm thinking we should probably draw it to a close because we've been going for a very long time, and I quite need the toilet.
Yeah.
But I think that we should probably do this again because I didn't get to speak to you about any of the things I was planning on speaking, because I wanted to speak to you about nearly dying twice. I wanted to speak to you about.
Yeah, I mean that was the only aspect really that I'd kind of guessed that you wanted to talk about, just because it was briefly mentioned when we communicated the other day. And whilst we won't go into any details about that now, it's more than twice.
It's more than twice.
Oh God, it's more than twice. It's quite significantly. It's more than twice.
Oh, okay, because I'm only aware of the coma and the mine.
Yeah, I know. There's guns. There's failed parachutes. There's all sorts.
Because I know that sort of like near-death experiences are something that people tend to be very interested in and tend to be quite transformative, and so I thought that would be of value for people to explore. And I also wanted to speak to you about I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong. Is it Srebrenica? Srebrenica, because it's something you've mentioned before that I felt like gave you some valuable insight into things that would warrant an interesting discussion. These are huge topics and that we've gone nowhere near in all this time.
Yeah. I mean, those are things. It's very easy to think that being about to die changes things. In very many ways, it does. But there's far more to it than that. It only changes things if you allow it to change.
Yeah,
it's only if you pursue the change. It doesn't just happen. You have to allow the change to happen, and then you have to. Sorry, when I say pursue it, you have to gain an understanding of it for it to be a permanent change. There has to be some level of understanding of what and why and how.
Yeah,
and exactly the same with things like spending time at Srebrenica. With finding bodies, pulling bodies out of pits. Of course it's going to affect you. But how it affects you psychologically depends on you, the person.
Yeah.
It's the age-old thing of if you allow yourself to become a victim, it'll affect you in a certain way. It deeply affected me. To the point where I found a rat floating in a water butt the other day, and the smell from that rat took me straight back to Srebrenica. Getting off that helicopter and walking over to where that pit full of bodies was, the smell, I can't describe it. I can't begin to describe it. All it's like flooding back. It's like it hit me like a ton of bricks. The smell from a rotting rat in the water butt.
Well, if it's something you'd be up for discussing, then I would be well up for.
I discuss
doing
it.
This again.
I make no promises as to what sort of state I'll be in discussing it, but I would discuss it.
Well,
and I'd be happy to be quite frank about it. It won't be a pleasant discussion because when I talk about Srebrenica, what I want people to know is what was found there, what we did there, and why we did it. I don't want to go into the politics of the Bosnian Serbs, why they did what they did, and why Mladic did what he did, and why the Croats did what they. That's a different discussion.
Yeah.
We're talking about humanity. We're talking about people. We're talking about human beings.
Well, and that is definitely the angle that I'm more interested in. Although I find history interesting, and I do like to understand these things. I think that the human aspect is where the most value is to people who would be listening.
Whether or not you're a believer in humanity is something that only you as an individual can decide, and what your opinion of exactly what humanity is, and whether you have any faith in humanity, that's an individual thing. And my time at Srebrenica is something that, made some big changes to me.
Yeah.
Big changes. Nearly dying, less so probably, surprisingly.
Yeah.
But I think that, it'll be interesting for me to actually talk about it, and talk about it to somebody who has an interest in understanding it and sees it. I mean, you analyse things in a very different way to me. We have some commonalities in the way that we perhaps can agree on certain subjects, and I can understand the points of view you're making, but I wouldn't necessarily think about them in that way.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to talk to you about things like Srebrenica, about things like hearing the click when you realise you've trodden on something that you really shouldn't, and how that, moving forward, it affects you on your day-to-day life. It's not all pleasant in terms of, the way it does affect you. It's lasting.
Yeah.
And it's significant.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's not.
But it's not necessarily in the way that you'd think.
Wow, that seems like a good cliffhanger to
allow you to
entice other people, other listeners in to listen next time.
It's been an interesting discussion.
A to be continued ... goes here.
Yeah, I would never, if I'd have decided to write down on a piece of paper what we'd end up talking about, I would never have guessed we'd end up talking about that.
No, I hadn't planned it. I thought let it flow and see what happens, and it was interesting.
One book to put up on the wall there: Soil and Soul.
Soil and Soul.
Yeah, Soil and Soul.
Who's it by?
I can't remember. I think his name's Alistair, but I could be wrong. But you'll find it. It's about a Scottish community overthrowing a corrupt laird.
Okay,
great book.
Well, I'll read it and then I'll get you on to discuss it with me.
Thanks, Robin.
All right. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers, mate.
Bye.